Taylor McHargue, CBS ESPN college football analyst, joins us most every Wednesday about this time. Does broadcasting at the games, played the game, quarterback at Rice, and also, of course, a broadcast analyst too. Taylor, all right, so we could spend forever, which we just did, looking at the bracket as it came out last night. What are one or two things that don't make sense to you, and in your opinion, what does?
Well, I guess we can start back with what we talked about last week with SMU. I think still sitting there at 13 is too low. But it's also interesting now, right, that BYU, who they have the head-to-head win on the road against SMU, they're now behind them. And I get it was not a great loss at home to Kansas, but I thought the discrepancy there between those two is interesting. The majority of this, the rest of the way, though, I thought shook out about how we expected. Obviously, that two-loss cluster of SEC teams, that's what's going to become more and more interesting down the stretch. And then where Indiana sits at 5, I think that's all going to come down to if they, obviously this week, assuming they don't go shock the world and pull the upset against Ohio State, if they lose and it's close, what do you do with that Indiana team sitting there at what likely ends up being 11-1? But the majority of the rankings where it's at right now, I think, is what we expected. I guess the last thing is, for right now at least, that Boise State, if they were to win out with where they're ranked, it looks like the committee has them slated for that 4 spot, getting a bye, and the Big 12 champion ending up having to play in that first round and not getting an automatic bye in one of those top 4 spots with coming into the season. I don't think anybody really gave much a likelihood that would be the case, but that's where it sits right now.
Do you think anybody told the committee that SMU is in a power conference?
Not according to the ESPN graphic that still had them at the bottom that they had clinched a berth in the American Conference Championship.
Way.
I told them, Taylor, I said, I don't think most people even – I said this a week ago. I really thought after the last playoff rankings, I think there's a lot of people that don't realize they're in the ACC right now.
I think the ACC number one, the ACC being down in general this year has not helped SMU. I also think SMU, just if you go down the list, last week against Boston College, that was one of the few times lately that they have been on ESPN and not on ACC Network. And I think that's hurt them some. And so obviously they control their destiny, right? It doesn't matter what happens the rest of the way. If they beat, whether it's Clemson or likely Miami in the conference championship, then none of this matters. And they're in, and they'd be in one of the top 4 spots. But for right now, I don't think there's any question if you asked who's the most disrespected team in all of these rankings, I don't think there's any question that it's SMU.
We're talking to Taylor McHargue, CBS and ESPN, broadcaster with us on 365 Sports.
Taylor, you look at, they're trying to compare losses. Is that really fair to do? Because it's hard to decide it.
Well, I think it depends. Let's use Arkansas as the example. They use that as a bad loss for Tennessee, but then it's listed as a good win for Texas. So they pick and choose. And what I think this is going to come down to is, and I go back to it, a lot of this is going to sort itself out with the majority of these teams. The cluster that it's going to get really difficult down the stretch, especially if Texas loses to A&M, is all these 2-loss SEC teams. We talked about these quality wins for Ole Miss, for example, but Ole Miss also has a loss at home to a Kentucky team that's not going to make a bowl game. So there are some blemishes on a number of these resumes. And so I think when you talk about some of these teams, and I go back to Indiana, if Indiana gets in at 11-1 over, let's use Ole Miss as the example, there's not going to be a loss on Indiana's schedule that is anything near as bad as what Ole Miss has with Kentucky. So you can kind of pick and choose your spots on this. I think the other one that just continues to get glossed over, and we'll see what happens this week against Army, but Notre Dame, it feels like that is the worst loss of any of these teams, in my opinion, with the home loss to Northern Illinois, who, by the way, Northern Illinois is like a middle-of-the-pack MAC team this year. It's not like they're going to go win the MAC. So that one, to me, continues to be glossed over, and they've got a couple quality wins, but it's not anything like what Georgia has out there in terms of quality wins. So the good news, again, like I keep saying, a lot of this is going to sort itself out. But the SEC having that group that continues to sort of round robin beat one another, It wouldn't, with the way that Florida played against LSU, it wouldn't altogether shock me if they came out and pulled the upset. They're at home against Ole Miss. They could potentially win that game. So that group out of the SEC, I think, is going to be most interesting with what do you do with those, 9, 10, 11 seeds.
Taylor, who do you think is the best team in the Big 12 right now? At BYU is kind of playing with fire. They finally get burned. They're still very much in the mix and in control of their own destiny, but Arizona State's pretty hot. Colorado's pretty hot right now. Just what do you think of the league at the top there as they race to Arlington?
Yeah, I think it's Colorado. I mean, I think they're playing the best football right now. I think it's also Arizona State right behind them. But if you ask me between, let's say, BYU, Colorado, and Arizona State, I think Colorado has the ability to run away from people right now. I think go back and look, just down the stretch, Arizona State, a lot of close games, a lot of one-score games, and some of those have gone their way. And credit to them for winning and how they've looked the last couple of weeks. A huge one this weekend, getting to host BYU in a game that I think Arizona State wins. But to me, the best team overall and that's playing the best football right now is Colorado out of the Big 12.
Do you think that would you say, of those teams is the most likely to win a playoff game?
I think that's also probably Colorado. I think the only caveat that I would add to that is if somehow BYU was getting to host. But BYU also just lost at home to Kansas. So right now, with the level of confidence that Colorado is playing with and their ability to score against what looks like basically anybody, I would say Colorado, and also if you're getting them to host, you're having to go to Boulder. I think they're probably in the best spot. Scadaboo with Arizona State, their ability to run the football, that transfers no matter where they're playing. But I go back to Arizona State has played a lot of close games. And at some point, you imagine, and Kenny Dillingham even said as much, that they're ahead of schedule by a year. And so, if they go on the road in a playoff spot in these close games, does that catch up with them? We'll see. Obviously, it's still a lot to be determined. But right now, I think Colorado is at the top, and I would give them the best chance of getting beyond just making it to the playoff, but actually winning a playoff game.
Ward Manuel is the one that speaks for the group, and we're not allowed to talk to anybody, even though we know a handful of people in the College Football Playoff Committee. Do you feel like when they're trying to pick the 12 teams to be in the playoff, that they have in any way discussions about who are the ones that could survive the playoff, as we talked about just a second ago, as far as who could win a game? Do you feel like that's even a part of it, or is it just getting the 12 for the first round or buys?
I think that may be part of it. And obviously that, look at where Army is right now. They don't have a particularly difficult schedule. Now, if they beat Notre Dame, then it gets really interesting. To your point, do you potentially end up with a scenario where undefeated Army gets in and Boise State is in, and one of them is your group of 5 champion, and then the other has a good enough resume that they're in no matter what? We'll see. That's, to your point, if Army were to be left out, I think that's the committee's way of saying, great run, great win over Notre Dame. We don't think there's any chance that they get beyond being in the first round. But to this point, I don't think there's any reason to really lean into that theory because everything to this point, for the most part, there's a couple spots that I think are unfair. We talked about it with SMU. But by and large, I don't think there's anything in here that's a total head scratcher. Army would be the one to me that would feed into that theory if they were to win out and beat Notre Dame.
So, Taylor, there's a lot of prognosticating on, throughout these playoff conversations about what might and happen and down the line and all that. But this weekend's going to clear some of this up, hopefully to a large extent. And one of those games that will do so is Ohio State and Indiana. Just the game itself. Buckeyes pretty heavy favorites at home. Can Kurt Cignetti and company keep the magic rolling? How do you feel about this one?
Yeah, this game to me it's like a playoff game for Indiana and not even meaning that they have to win. I think we talked about it last week, but Indiana needs to keep this game close. If they go in and they get blown out like what Illinois did, where they got killed by Oregon earlier in the year and that sort of took them out from being a darling, that's the worst case for Indiana. If they go in, they keep this close, it's competitive, and they lose by 1 score, I think Indiana's in the playoffs. If they go in and lose by 5 touchdowns and it's not competitive, that's where a 2-loss SEC team has a realistic chance of being in over all of these 2-loss SEC teams, get in over Indiana, where you say, look at the wins that they have, and when they played up, so to speak, against Ohio State if they got blown out. That's going to get used against them.
Do you think if A&M beats Texas, do they have the juice to not only win the SEC title game, but also win a playoff game?
I don't think, two-part question, I don't think they would win against, in the SEC championship, and I'm basing this primarily off of, let's assume, Georgia, neutral site. I don't think they win that game. If you have to go to Kyle Field in a playoff game, I think they've got as good a chance as anybody to win a first-round playoff game if they're hosting. So the scenario for that to happen, I think it's unlikely they would be hosting, but I would not give them great odds of winning on a neutral site against Georgia.
Taylor, it's amazing. I hope that do you hope that they stick with 12 for more than just, I know that they have it set up for, a couple of years or so without jumping to conclusions about 16. Should they make sure that they get this right before they look at anything else?
Yeah, I think so. I think the model that we have right now, the best part about this, in my opinion, is going to be these home playoff games. And so my reasoning for why I think 16 would not necessarily be the worst thing is because you get more of these home playoff games. So just selfishly as a fan, and I think it gives you the opportunity to tie in more of the bowl games, and it keeps more kids engaged and not entering the transfer portal immediately. That's not what most people talk about getting to 16 teams. Those really aren't the reasons you hear. A lot of it is making sure that these teams that are going to be left out at that 12, 13, or 13, 14 spot that, they deserve to be in, and that you solve for that getting to 16. But my biggest reason for it is you get more home playoff games, which we haven't seen them yet, but I think it's going to be fantastic and a huge lift for the sport.
I saw where they have interviewed at Rice, I think, Nick Rolovich, who was fired at Washington State because he didn't want to get the vaccine for the COVID. He's a hell of a football coach. Your thoughts about the Owls talking to him?
Yeah, from what I hear, and I don't hear much, I'm not in any sort of inner circle there, and everything that I hear is secondhand, but it does sound like Rice is down to a short list and a decision trying to be made before certainly the transfer portal window opens, which I don't think that's a shock given when they moved on from Mike Bloomgren. Don't know Rolovich personally, but his resume, winning a conference championship at Hawaii, is incredibly difficult. That was a statement for that program. And then at Washington State, he had them in a really good spot when COVID hit. And obviously we all know how that went about with not getting the vaccine and then stepping away for a period of time. I think his on-field performance and what he'd put out there specifically at Hawaii, I think that would give me, just as a fan of Rice, I think that would be exciting to me. But again, I know there's still a couple other candidates that it sounds like are that they are talking to. And again, I don't know what direction Rice is going to ultimately go in, but I think Rolovich would be something that I would imagine most Rice fans would be excited about.
Thank you, man. Have a great weekend. Appreciate your time and knowledge, Taylor.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Taylor McHargue, ESPN and CBS college football analyst.